One of the individuals that I've interacted with a little bit in his a book on natural theology, surprisingly, is N.T. Wright. We think of him as a New Testament scholar, and you think of the disagreements that we Reformed people have with him over his new perspectives on Paul. But more recently, he started to write a little bit on natural theology. He was actually invited to do the Gifford Lectures, I think in 2019, and out of that has come a book called History and Eschatology, which you might think is also an odd name for a book on natural theology, but then he's written more, slightly more on a popular level. Now he has a thing on YouTube coming out of that same lecture series. It's a minor note. It was suggested to me. I read a good chunk of it, and it is apparent to me that the same sort of interests that he has in biblical theology are what he wants to construct a new kind of natural theology. So he's pro-natural theology in a sense, but he wants to have let history, and particularly the history that forms a backdrop to the biblical story, and then through that, biblically defined history, and particularly centering on the gospel and Jesus and his kingdom invading this world, and through that we see nature beginning to form signposts to that new world. And that is his conception of natural theology. Now, if you want to include that in natural theology, I actually have no problem with it. It's very interesting. But if you want to set that against the more traditional metaphysical sense of natural theology, then I would have a problem with it. And that's what I start to sense. Not just in him, but in others. But Wright is the latest to go in this direction. So I'm just going to interact with him a little bit in this video, because I think part of what he wants to do is pin the older view of natural theology on what emerged in the modern view. That's not new either. Kant did that. He criticized the old arguments for the existence of God. No, he didn't. He criticized the ones that were most immediate to him, whether it was Christian Wolff's version of the ontological argument, or Samuel Clarke, or whoever, or Butler. And I don't remember all of who he had in mind, but he certainly was not seriously dealing with Thomas Aquinas or even Anselm's ontological argument in his critique of pure reason and the antinomies. Anyway, enough about Kant. Let's get to Wright and see if we can make head or tail out of what he's saying.
Going back to the 18th century, the great theologian, again in the north of England at the time, was Joseph Butler, who ended up his career as Bishop of Durham, and who, when he was a younger man, had written the Analogy of Religion, responding to the deist critique of Christianity, namely, how can you read a Bible which is so full of dark and mysterious and violent things? And Butler said, actually, that is the way the whole world is. Look at the world of nature, and you'll see we have the same puzzles, and then we see what God has done and is doing about them. So all of that was a way of saying, yes, we can be secure. There is this thing which is a natural knowledge of God, and we can follow it through. And that is typical of the natural theology which was popular in the early 18th century, and as we've seen with Buick, continued well on into the 19th century and is still to be found in many places and in many ways. But the tide was turning in other directions. And in Europe and America at the time, there were many who were saying, actually, we can't be sure. Actually, we can't believe the Bible. We're not sure about who Jesus really was. And we're not actually sure, even if there was a God, is a God, could be a God. There was a rejection particularly of the perceived privilege of Christianity, often fueled by resentment against the church for its power, its wealth, and so on. And there was skepticism about the official teaching. Many people wanted to know, how can we be sure? How can we really know? And they were fed up particularly with the wars of religion that had gone on since the 16th century, often tragically different branches of the Christian faith embraced by different countries or regions that were then fighting one another and using religion.
Two things strike me. One, attacking symptom level rather than disease. All of those things are things that cause people to start to look elsewhere than in the traditional form of the Christian claim. However, you can't really tackle that or understand it to begin with unless you grapple with the criticisms made, particularly by David Hume and then Immanuel Kant. And of course, there were others, but those are central figures in really chopping at the branch of understanding what the power is behind causality in the case of Hume, and then cutting all the way down to the roots of reason, and particularly metaphysically being able to say this is the way things are outside of all of our minds. Everything else is really symptom level. Those other things would not have gotten very far if these more fundamental doubts did not hold sway. But then the other observation I have there is that the other things Wright is bringing up are what Plantinga has called de jure objections as opposed to de facto objections. In other words, they're the kind of criticisms that would have been made by a Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, or Freud. In other words, X belief is not to be taken seriously anymore because of the illegitimate or suspicious way, or natural, perfectly natural, and meaning that in the bad way, in the sense that it has no more elevated status than some other natural desire or projection or whatever it is, whether psychological or social, that belief is to be invalidated not because it does not correspond to the way the world is outside of our minds, as measured by various criteria, such as logic, empirical attestation, or existential livability. No, it is to be invalidated on the basis of how the idea was formed. That's a de jure objection. That you just believe that because the church told you that. Whatever. Or because you're a capitalist. Because you're a man. Or something like that. Anyway, those are not good arguments, and the first response to such arguments should be to point out that they are not good arguments. Psychological theories as to why we develop the ideas that we have in our minds may be interesting, but they don't give us any hint whatsoever as to whether or not the view is more or less likely to be true. So, let me just go to Wright one more time and see what else he has to say.
As they would call it, as an excuse for what they were doing. And so they were saying, we've got to forget all that we've been taught by the church, and we've got to see if actually there are other ways of knowing God. And it was in that context that some people were saying, well, natural theology is the answer. The problem is, though, that it's not that easy. It's not going to be that easy because all sorts of things come back at us to say, well, when we look at the natural world, what we see is precisely nature red in tooth and claw. We see disasters. We see all sorts of crazy stuff going on, as well as the stars circling the world, and as well as the birds and the animals and the fish and so on. So the 18th century was a very turbulent time, a time of great uncertainty, a time when the traditions were being reaffirmed, but then all sorts of things were happening that made it much harder for people to go on and embrace this. And as we have seen over the last 200 years since that time, there's a very complex confluence of thought in Europe and America in particular, which have resulted in all sorts of new questions which have come up. And natural theology has sometimes been rubbished by people who've said, well, we've tried that and it doesn't work. Sometimes by Christians who've said, well, we may try it, but it will only lead us to idolatry. And sometimes by non-Christians who, as we'll see, have said, well, the world is actually a darker and much more mysterious place. So what we're going to do in subsequent sessions is to look at some of those movements of thought which have radically shaped the way in which we have got to where we've got in our culture, in our subcultures, in the Western world of Europe and America. I'm very much aware that there may be plenty of people watching courses like this who don't belong to those particular subcultures. Absolutely fine.
Well,
unfortunately, or fortunately, the sorts of...
It'll be interesting to read more of what Wright has to say about that, given that analysis. But he does bring in one of the pet objections of that era in the 18th century that not only went against Butler but against Leibniz in particular. His Theodicy was the butt of, I don't want to say the butt of the joke, but the target of Voltaire. And I don't know if it was only Wright or if it was somebody else, but somebody used the expression. I wouldn't be surprised if Wright did, but natural theology before Lisbon, or pre-Lisbon natural theology. What is he referring to? The Lisbon, Portugal earthquake of the 1750s. It was a massive catastrophe that it caused people to rethink, and even inspired people. And there was a debate even between Voltaire and Rousseau, actually, on the question. Interestingly enough, where you could tell, where Voltaire was going to take the position against the idea that nature is good. Now, so Wright made this description there of nature, tooth and claw. But again, the argument has to be shoved back to Hume and Voltaire. Hume will not just say that the nature, and this is in his dialogues concerning natural religion. You can tell who is carrying the Hume voice in that dialogue, and the idea is that nature is not only cruel, but it is futile in the sense of wasteful. You hear that from Darwinians as well. The eye is inefficient. The sea lion, look at that pathetic eye. And there's so much waste in all these things. And I want to respond first. What were you expecting? What is this alternative universe by which you judge the lack of design and the optimal usage of space in that universe? It's just a hint of what the pushback could look like. These are invalid arguments. In fact, they're theological arguments, aren't they? They're arguments about what a designer would or could do given a universe. And those are the kind of arguments that have to be made, that used to be made from a metaphysical point of view, even if they were deconstructing arguments. We Christians can do some deconstruction of our own, and that's actually one area where we would not disagree with presuppositionalists in terms of their method. There's a deconstructive element. But of course, as Santayana pointed out in Skepticism and Animal Faith, as 1922, thereabouts, that skepticism itself is a form of dogma. Skepticism presupposes certain non-negotiables that must be true, that are the basis. Why do you doubt such and such? What reason do you have? Well, whatever reason that is your jumping off point. You can't do that out of midair, but only on the basis of something solid. So, as Santayana said, skepticism is a form of dogma. In the same way, deconstruction can't just be deconstruction. That's sort of a Pyrrhonian skepticism, an extreme version that just burns the whole house down. But, of course, you have to stand on something in order to light the match. And so, anyway, there's a place for it, but it's not the only thing. There has to be a metaphysical foundation. You can't have natural theology of any kind without going back behind Kant. So that's what I would suggest, is not to accept. You're always going to be playing catch-up. You're always going to be accepting the terms of disbelief, of anti-metaphysics, of the subjective inward turn of the Enlightenment, unless you get behind Kant, unless you know what was wrong with his critique, and likewise with Hume. Anyway, I didn't get on here to pick on Wright. I was actually experimenting to see if the audio would actually work on this thing. I'm going to try to put together some videos like this where I interact with various people, and in this case, probably a lot on the subject of natural theology, since that's what I'm in the middle of doing, my dissertation. So, there you go. A little interaction, little introduction of N.T. Wright's ideas of those things.